Clarissa had a theory in those days. They had heaps of theories, always theories, as young people have. It was to explain the feeling they had of dissatisfaction, not knowing people, not being known. For how could they know each other? You met every day, then not for 6 months or years. It was unsatisfactory, they agreed, how little one knew people. But, she said, sitting on the bus going up Shaftesbury Avenue, she felt herself everywhere, not here, 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 and she tapped the back of the seat, but everywhere. She waved her hand going up Shaftesbury Avenue. She was all that. So that to know her, or anyone, one must seek out the people who completed them, even the places.
Ho-dee-oh, 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 ho. Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we are taking a look at Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. It's a book I read very early on in life, and it was neat to return to it. I'm going to be eager to hear about your thoughts.
Yeah, same here. I haven't read it for many decades, and I was more than happy to return to it. And it was every bit as good as I remembered, possibly better, frankly.
Yeah, different.
Well, definitely different to read it as an older person, closer to Mrs. Dalloway's age now than in the flashbacks that they keep going to in the book, which is when I first read it.
Yeah, me too.
I will let people know that if they don't know already, there are certain topics that come up over the course of the novel. So there's a bit of a content warning here that we will be talking about mental illness and specifically suicide. But yes, Mrs. Dalloway, we've been doing a lot of Virginia Woolf lately, it feels like.
Yeah, we did To the Lighthouse in the first year that we were doing the podcast together. And then more recently, we did Orlando, which was super fun.
Yeah. And it's interesting to read this. I mean, I guess this is in many ways her most famous, certainly her most famous piece of fiction, I guess.
I don't know. I think, I could be wrong, but I think that the one that's the most canonical is To the Lighthouse. At least that's the one that tends to show up in literature surveys a little bit more. But personally, if I had to choose one, I think they're both great. But this one is a little closer to my heart, I think, of the two.
Well, let's get right into it. We have talked about Virginia Woolf a few times, so listeners may remember some of the biographical details, but let's give a quick refresher and maybe especially point out stuff that's relevant to this novel.
Yeah, let me just say a little bit about Virginia Woolf. She was born in 1882, died in 1941 during World War II. She comes from a really interesting family of artists, writers, and thinkers of various sorts. She was the seventh of 8 children. And I mention that because especially the younger children were very close. Virginia Woolf, her sister Vanessa, and her brothers Adrian and Toby. And in fact, after the death of their father in 1904, their mother having died some years earlier, the 4 of them lived together. And they formed a kind of a very tight-knit family community that they'd bring in friends and lovers of various sorts and partners. And that whole dynamic is what's sometimes described as the Bloomsbury group of artists and writers. A really interesting group of people to study collectively as well as individually. Virginia Woolf, during the time she was living with her siblings in Bloomsbury, attended King's College London for a bit, doing some courses in classics and history. And I mention those because some interesting little elements of that show up here. For example, Greek language shows up in an interesting kind of way that we might talk about later on. She also suffered from mental illness from her young teens onward, and this is something she dealt with recurrently throughout her whole life, and in fact caused the end of her life at her own hand in 1941. She had a number of really important interpersonal relationships in her life, and one of them was with her sister, Vanessa Bell, siblings, but also having a relationship that 2 artists might have. Vanessa Bell was a sort of a painter, Virginia Woolf a writer, but they clearly were very much involved with one another's work. Her spouse, Leonard Woolf, also very close, and also Vita Sackville-West, who's someone we talked about in a little bit more detail when we were reading Orlando. Other than mentioning some of her most important books, Mrs. Dalloway, To the Lighthouse, and Orlando, I think being chief among them, I just want to say a little bit about the printing press that she and Leonard Woolf ran together. The Hogarth Press was a letter press, a sort of a small outfit, which they ran not so much to make money, but as to sort of provide a place to print things that they really wanted to print. So it wasn't primarily profit driven, but more a way of getting work out there that they thought was valuable and important. They printed T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. They printed the standard English translation of the works of Sigmund Freud, and they printed quite a number of Woolf's own works. And Virginia Woolf was involved in this press not only in a kind of abstract way, but she actually used to lay the type Like she would do the typesetting by the manual typesetting. So it was a kind of a hands-on occupation. And I think, again, that might kind of emerge as part of the conversation in some interesting ways when we're talking about Mrs. Dalloway.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, for those who don't know it, or for those who haven't read it in a little while, let's go over what happens in Mrs. Dalloway, which is, again, a lot.
It's a lot and a little, right? It's over a very tight period of time.
Yeah, it takes place over the course of just one day in the middle of June 1923 in central London, just a few years after the end of the First World War, whose effects are still being felt throughout the novel. Clarissa Dalloway is going to be throwing a party that night, and the high society of London, including the Prime Minister, have been invited. And in addition, 3 people who've had a romantic connection to Clarissa will be there. Her husband, Richard, of course, a reasonably successful politician who never quite managed to get a position in the cabinet. Peter Walsh, recently returned from India, who once proposed marriage to Clarissa only for her to reject him, which he's never fully gotten over. And Sally Seton, who she had an intense relationship with in her youth, but what she wonders could ever have come of that. In fact, all 4 knew each other when they were young, and we get lots of flashbacks to those days. Now, Clarissa begins her day by heading out into the city to buy flowers for the party, and as she encounters various people throughout the city, the narration jumps into the perspectives and interior monologues of dozens and dozens of people. The most important character we meet who isn't in Clarissa's circle of friends is Septimus Warren Smith and his wife Lucrezia. He served in the war, and it changed him, and he is struggling. He thinks he might have been granted insight into the world, the sort of insight you might try to start a religion over. And he also has strong suicidal ideation. His wife, who he met in Italy during the war, and who knows no one in England other than him really, has no framework to understand what is wrong with her husband and what can be done to help him. He's been seeing one doctor, Dr. Holmes, who has not been very effective at treating him, and today he is going to see Sir William Bradshaw, who will recommend that Septimus get some rest away from his wife. But this plan will not see fruition. Septimus will take his own life today, jumping out a window at his home. Sir Bradshaw will hear of his patient's death, and at Clarissa's party, for of course he was invited, he will tell Septimus' story to Richard Dalloway, hoping for some legislation to be passed to aid soldiers dealing with stress from the war. Clarissa will overhear the story of Septimus' suicide, and she will try to understand his act in terms of her own life. And Peter Walsh and Sally Seton, who have not seen each other since their youth, will try to make sense of what has changed and what hasn't over the past 30 years, as Peter waits to have one more conversation with Clarissa Dalloway.
It's a lot happening.
There is so much happening. There are so many characters that we get to experience the interiority of, and yet nothing is happening. And yet it's just a day. I mean, I guess things are happening. Someone dies and a party is held, but that hardly feels like, a tremendous plot.
Yeah. It's not plot as such, right?
Yeah. And yet actually it is kind of carefully plotted as we see some of the things that have to happen to get all of the players into the same party or be mentioned. Like there is some intricacies to the plot, but it's not like a thrilling adventure story.
Yeah, no, I was thinking about this as you were sort of summarizing, the plot, summarizing what takes place, the way in which we move from one subjectivity to another. And, maybe we're moving through the city together with one person, let's say Peter Walsh, and then he passes somebody or he sees something, and then we're all of a sudden in the subjectivity of that other person. This is something that we as 21st century readers are really, really ready to, take for granted and to understand seamlessly because of the way film works, right? I mean, you'll be following one character and then you start following another character, right? That's something we're accustomed to. Like we have a visual vocabulary for it. But in a novel, it must have really blown people's minds when this kind of stuff was happening in the 20s.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just film. Of course, we've had now 100 years of novels doing this, and it's a lot more common to have novels. Well, it seems more common for novels to jump from chapter to chapter between perspectives. Like that seems like a very common thing for novels to do now.
But here it just happens like seamlessly, line to line, right?
Paragraph to paragraph, or even mid-paragraph, you might jump bodies, so to speak. And you get some characters who show up only for a few paragraphs, and you learn details about them, and you have no idea, at least on the first read, if they're going to reappear or not. Early on, shortly after we meet Septimus, we jump into this girl named Maisie Johnson. She's 19. She's visiting London for the first time. She's finding it all very, quote-unquote, queer and feeling like she'll remember it forever. And that's it. That's all we know about her. But we get inside her head for a paragraph or two to find that out.
Yeah, and she thinks ahead to like 50 years later, she'll always remember this moment when she's an old lady. And I remember reading that passage, recently, and I'm like, so this comes out in 1924, 1925. So she's imagining, 1974 or whatever. And it was just weird to think about this kind of time travel embedded in like you said, a single tiny paragraph where we glimpse this person.
But it's also reflecting how some of the other characters feel, right? You can imagine the first time Clarissa Dalloway goes to the city. Actually, I'm not 100% sure where she spent her youth. We get scenes of the seaside town that she spends her summers, but nevertheless, you get the sense of like the things that she experienced when she was 19 being with her forever, and how that stays true and how that doesn't quite play out the way that Maisie seems to be thinking of it, because they get folded in with all the other experiences you have.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I find so extraordinary about, the experience of reading this, the way in which we kind of move between different time frames. And to kind of contextualize that, like I kind of want to back up and talk about like what it feels like to read this book. I mentioned I read this really early in life. I must have been like, I don't know, 14 or 15 or something like that. So, old enough to kind of intellectually understand the words, right? But only just on the threshold of understanding some of the subjective or personal kinds of dimensions of what was happening there. And so reading it now, and it was the same when I read it then, I'm absolutely enchanted by the way in which it's so imagistic. Like the writing is very beautiful, and it's kind of pulling you constantly from one place to another, to the past, to the future, from one subjectivity to another. I'm just going to give one example of what this feels like. It's quite a lovely passage, I think. One I remember loving the first time I read this book. It's near the beginning, and this is Clarissa's mind we're in. Bond Street fascinated her. Bond Street early in the morning in the season, its flags flying, its shops, no splash, no glitter, one roll of tweed in the shop where her father had bought his suits for 50 years, a few pearls, salmon on an ice block. That is all, she said, looking at the fishmongers. That is all, she repeated, pausing for a moment at the window of a glove shop where, before the war, you could buy almost perfect gloves. And her old Uncle William used to say, a lady is known by her shoes and her gloves. He had turned on his bed one morning in the middle of the war. He had said, I've had enough. Gloves and shoes. She had a passion for gloves, but her own daughter, her Elizabeth, cared not a straw for either of them. Not a straw, she thought, going on up Bond Street to a shop where they kept flowers for her when she gave a party. So it's just this weird little passage, right? She's walking down the street. It's like a flâneur, right? It's somebody who's looking in the shop windows, a roll of tweed, pearls, salmon, flowers. But the journey is back and forward in time, right? She's back to when her father bought his suits 50 years ago, back to her Uncle William, who we used to say that a lady is known by her shoes and her gloves, his death, during the First World War. And so she's like sort of moving. I don't know. I found that quality of this writing really, really enchanting and really took it to heart. Actually, I was very devoted to gloves at that stage of life, no doubt influenced by this passage.
That's interesting, because I'm not 100% sure that the idea that, she's looking at it and thinking, oh, you used to be able to buy almost perfect gloves here is something that you're supposed to emulate.
I totally took that 100% on board, I have to confess.
That's a really great passage to look at what's going on here, because, as you say, she's seeing a bunch of things, right? As she's walking through the streets of the city, she's seeing a fishmonger's and then immediately seeing the glove shop and then seeing, this other place and this other place. And they're all triggering memories for her, which she has just enough time to have a little bit of insight into before the next thing on the street comes by. This is, it seems to me, a very urban thing, right? Where you're walking along and you have so much stimulus. You have so many people and so many markers of civilization, like stores, that you are able to jump in and out of memory or empathetic relationships with others, where you're seeing, regarding, and then thinking about their interiority.
That's a really interesting thing to think about. I always think of the counterfactual. What would it be like if we were walking through the countryside seeing things, right? It would be very different, right? I'm thinking back to things like Middlemarch and so on, right? We'd see things in the natural world that could lure us into having a sense of kind of continuity through time and a sense of historical place. But here in the city, things are moving, right? Things are changing constantly. Commodities come and go, right? And we remember our relationship to these commodities, the tweed that our father used to buy, the gloves that she would buy, the fish, the flowers, right? So it's a very different engagement with the material world.
Yeah. I mean, we just looked at a novel that was all about a ramble through the countryside in the Sebald novel. And there, while he was thinking about one thing or another, most of that was internal prompting, right? You think about one story and it reminds you of another story and it reminds you of another story. Here, there are these external prompts that keep the stories short, usually.
That's exactly right.
And it just creates a very different vibe of what the rhythm of the interior monologues are like. And of course, jumping from one person to another, as you get to do when you see them, and you're this, omniscient narrator who's able to jump between interiorities.
Yeah, and this city, these different places, these different points are what, in a sense, kind of makes up the person. There's a number of passages where we see a reference to the person, whether it's Clarissa or Peter, or gathering themselves together. It's almost like they're dissipated in all these locations, right, within the city, and they pull themselves into one when they have to, take the plunge to do this or do that. There's a beautiful illustration of this when Peter is going to Clarissa's party, and you could tell he's kind of nervous about it. And he really has to gather himself together to do it. And so here's a few lines. It was her street, this, Clarissa's. Cabs were rushing round the corner like water round the piers of a bridge drawn together. It seemed to him because they bore people going to her party, Clarissa's party. The cold stream of visual impressions failed him now, as if the eye were a cup that overflowed and let the rest run down its china walls unrecorded. The brain must wake now. The body must contract now, entering the house, the lighted house where the door stood open, where the motor cars were standing and bright women descending. The soul must brave itself to endure. He opened the big blade of his pocket knife. So it's like it's this way in which you come from the city, from the sort of the sprawl of the city into these interior spaces. And it's like you have to kind of gather yourself or pull yourself into one thing. It seems to me very specifically a kind of subjectivity that emerges from the city.
Yeah, and it makes an interesting comparison from the other location where we sort of in the time of the novel don't spend, but except in flashback, which is the village of Borton, where Clarissa and a lot of these other characters spent time during their youth spent with each other, which is not a very urban environment. And so, what is the quality there? Well, you have these young people who are making the world amongst themselves, so to speak. They're sitting around all the time and they're conversing with one another and coming up with theories and getting into petty arguments and silly jokes. But it feels much more like they are creating their own world because there is not as much of an urban stimulus around them to lose themselves into or to be molded by.
Yeah, they're on the threshold of that world, I think.
Exactly. It contrasts, again, interestingly, with, say, Elizabeth Dalloway, Clarissa's daughter, who at one point triumphantly boards a bus.
Yeah, she's an interesting character, isn't she? Because she's at such an interesting point in life. She's 17 years old, right? So she's an adult, but she's just out socially, right? But she's just on the threshold of that part of her life. And it's really, it's in much the way that the people who were back on the terrace all those years ago were,
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing because she spends quite a lot of the day, quite a lot of the novel, locked up with one person, so to speak. She's in her room with her teacher, I guess you would say, Miss Kilman, with whom she has an interesting relationship.
Yeah.
Yes. But, she's getting sort of private instruction for a while. And then towards the end of the day, they head off into the city to, I guess, do some shopping. And then after that, Elizabeth leaves her behind and then triumphantly boards a bus and exalts in being around all these people. And you have this sense of, they're in this sort of cut off, making their own world kind of environment at first. Sort of like, what Borton would have been, you can imagine. Elizabeth's room where she's getting lessons is a bit like that. But then she leaves it and goes into the big city and is able to feel that tremendous expansion that can happen when you're just surrounded by all kinds of humanity.
Yeah, it's such a neat passage because she leaves where she's having tea with her companion, and she suddenly steps forward and most competently boards the omnibus in front of everybody. And it's
Competently.
like, yeah, I know. It's such an interesting passage. It's like this 5 or 6 page long passage that's about her riding the omnibus. And it's like she's, I don't know, riding a horse or something like that.
It's her apotheosis, right?
Yeah. She took a seat on top. The impetuous creature, a pirate, started forward, sprang away. She had to hold the rail to steady herself, for a pirate it was, reckless, unscrupulous, bearing down ruthlessly. And it goes on. And it's like, wow, this is an extravagant comparison. What is going on here?
Yeah, it's so triumphant. It's just like, and the way she's framing it is just like, yes, a Dalloway has ridden the bus.
Yeah, no, but it's like, again, it's like so dramatic. Now it was like riding, to be rushing up Whitehall, and to each movement of the omnibus, the beautiful body in the fawn-colored coat responded freely like a rider, like the figurehead of a ship. For the breeze slightly disarrayed her. The heat gave her cheeks the pallor of white-painted wood, and her fine eyes, having no eyes to meet, gazed ahead, blank, bright, with the staring, incredible innocence of sculpture. I mean, there's a lot going on there.
There is a lot. And like, I get it in a certain sense, right? Like, public transportation is great. And the freedom that it can allow a young person is amazing.
And the open top of the bus, right?
Yeah, the open top of the bus. You get to see the city. You get to see the people. You get to feel part of everything. Like, it can be tremendously powerful. And yet, it's such a weird passage.
It is. And especially when you think about that sort of visuality that's evoked in those last few lines. You know, her eyes, having no eyes to meet, gazed ahead, blank, bright, with the staring, incredible innocence of sculpture. Like, she's seeing, but not being seen. Like, she's not the object of other people seeing her, except presumably the narrator here or people who see her from the street. You know, so it's a moment where she's empowered, and the way she's empowered is in part through that act of seeing without being seen by others.
Yeah, without being defined by the expectations of her parents, which are somewhat suffocating for her.
Or Miss Kilman or anybody.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
It's a really neat kind of way of capturing her subjectivity. And it's such a weird and interesting counterpart to the way in which her parents see her. So Clarissa and Elizabeth's father, Richard Dalloway, both refer to her as my Elizabeth. Like, they'll use that phrase. Like, she's, you know, it's almost a little bit infantilizing, right? But where Elizabeth actually is somewhere quite different. There's this one beautiful metaphor where Clarissa's thinking about Elizabeth. She says, as a child, she'd had a perfect sense of humor, but now at 17, why Clarissa could not in the least understand, she had become very serious, like a hyacinth sheathed in glossy green, with buds just tinted, a hyacinth which has had no sun. Again, it's a really interesting metaphor, right?
Yeah.
What is going on there? I think that's the thing that totally took me in about Woolf when I first started reading her book. Like, the metaphors are just amazing, you know, because they're so multi-layered. Like this hyacinth one here, right? It's about her youth. It's about her potentiality. It's about her being about to be something else, which is a flower completely in bloom, right? And there's a way of thinking about that in very objectified kind of terms. But there's also something, I don't know, quite transgressive about it.
There's also the fact that Clarissa cannot stand Miss Kilman.
Absolutely not. She loathes her.
And some of that is for reasons that, you know, probably she wouldn't like her in any context. Miss Kilman has found God and is very opinionated in ways that clash with Mrs. Dalloway's opinions. But it seems much more important that Miss Kilman is coming in and taking over the role of mother. Or something, or intimate connection, or someone who has that kind of claim on Elizabeth that Mrs. Dalloway feels should be hers. And it feels very Freudian, in a sense, this competition of parental affection / love, because especially with Woolf, there's always a bit of suspicion that there may be something going on between characters such as Elizabeth and Miss Kilman when they're behind closed doors for hours at a day. And later on, we do find out that Miss Kilman's appreciation of Elizabeth does seem a bit more, you know.
She has passion for her. I mean, however you want to understand that, she has passion for her. It's clear.
Yeah, sort of emotional and seemingly physical passion for her in some sense that maybe she doesn't fully understand. So that does seem to be going on. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. It's interesting how this is. I mean, I'm not an expert on Freud, but it's interesting how this is playing with some of those theories about parental replacement and such.
And there's a whole additional layer to this, too, that's all about the class dynamic, right? The extent to which either Clarissa's contempt for Miss Kilman or Miss Kilman's perception of Clarissa's contempt for her is arising from class differences. In a passage just after, actually, the one I was reading earlier, where Elizabeth's sort of likened to a hyacinth not yet in bloom, we go from Elizabeth's interiority to Miss Kilman's interiority, and her thoughts are like this. She was poor, moreover, degradingly poor. Otherwise, she would not be taking jobs from people like the Dalloways. Mr. Dalloway, to do him justice, had been kind, but Mrs. Dalloway had not. She had been merely condescending. She came from the most worthless of all classes, the rich with a smattering of culture. They had expensive things everywhere, pictures, carpets, lots of servants. She considered that she had a perfect right to anything that the Dalloways did for her. She'd been cheated. So that's a neat passage in two ways. First, again, it's that wonderful illustration of how we seamlessly move from one person's subjectivity into another. You know, you're well into it before you figure out, oh, wow, we're in somebody else's head now. And then also the way in which class is playing a huge part. So it's not just about the psychoanalytical frameworks that are governing how people understand themselves and relate to one another, but also the structures of class that they inhabit.
Which is throughout the entire book, right? This is a book that's very aware of class.
Oh my God, completely.
You know, it doesn't just spend its time in, so to speak, the upper crust or give their positions. It does dip into a few characters, including some of the servants that work for the Dalloways, including the shopkeepers and so forth, including a few people who are just living on the street.
And Septimus and his wife Lucrezia as well.
And then, yeah, most notably Septimus and Lucrezia, who are in an interesting position class-wise, I guess. I can't fully articulate what level of class Septimus originally came from. It doesn't seem to be the poorest of the poor. He grew up as a sort of kid who loved Shakespeare and poetry and all that sort of stuff, and then went off to the war and came back highly decorated. He had some terrible experiences during the war, but he came back alive and decorated and now seems to be living a relatively comfortable lifestyle, except that he is suffering from the stress of the war and what that has done to his psyche.
What we would probably now describe as PTSD, or what in the years right after World War I was being described as shell shock, right? So the novel, which comes out in 1925, is set in 1923. So just 5 years after the end of World War I, at a time when there were a lot of these young men, right, who had come back and were not quite right? And Septimus is part of that generation. But also the way that he's characterized here in the novel, I think speaks to, okay, but it goes far beyond just this phenomenon of PTSD to sort of bring out what is it for a person to be suffering from severe mental illness, not just as they're perceived by those who encounter them, including their loved ones, but also what's it like from inside. And I have to say, for me, there's a lot of things in this book, but that aspect of this book is the one that, like, I find really powerful, the interiority of Septimus.
It's very interesting because he himself has several modes of interiority. There are times when he is relatively quote unquote normal. There are times when he is in full religious rapture mode and he's having ecstatic visions and understandings of how the trees are alive and how people must be told of these things. And so you get to experience all these different modalities within his thoughts, very often immediately contrasted by his wife, who just has no access to any of this and is upset and confused about what's going on.
Well, she's literally trying to keep him anchored to the earth, right? There's a great passage where that anchoring function, which is a metaphor for what she's doing, but becomes kind of literal. This is right at the end of that awesome long passage that describes skywriting. There's a plane that's writing letters in the sky. It goes on over several passages, and we sort of pass through the interiority of a whole bunch of people who are united by this thing that they're looking at. And anyway, so toward the end of that long passage, there's somebody who's spelling out a couple of the letters, and Septimus hears it, and he hears that person's voice, and it takes him on this kind of I don't know, hallucinatory kind of journey. A marvelous discovery indeed that the human voice in certain conditions can quicken trees into life. Happily, Rezia put her hand with a tremendous weight on his knee so that he was weighted down, transfixed, or the excitement of the elm trees rising and falling with all their leaves alight, and the color thinning and thickening from blue to the green of a hollow wave, like plumes on horses' heads, feathers on ladies, so proudly they rose and fell, so superbly, would have sent him mad. But he would not go mad. He would shut his eyes. He would see no more. But they beckoned. Leaves were alive. Trees were alive. And the passage goes on. The whole thing is amazing. But it captures what Rezia is offering to him, which is, like I said, metaphorical and literally kind of keeping him anchored. And the ecstatic vision that he's having, which is, like you were describing as religious. I mean, it's kind of religious, but it's also like where everything makes sense to him. It all hangs together. There's this coherence, and he can just glimpse it in these moments. And sometimes it's ecstatic. At other moments, the hallucinations he has are absolutely terrifying. And I don't know, I find that really fascinating.
Yeah, and it feels like such a sympathetic portrayal of both the interiority of that kind of moment, but also the effects it has. So, the way that Lucrezia is upset and can't figure out what to do about it is one thing, but also just how there is no option for this, right? Like the Dr. Holmes comes in, the sort of local doctor who's not a specialist in this, and is like, oh, you need to go to the theater. You need to put a smile on your face.
Don't think about stuff so much.
It's so useless.
Oh, man.
And it is just reinforcing every terrible stereotype about both how Septimus / a man should be in the world, and narrowing those options down and so forth. But even when he sees Sir William Bradshaw, who is a bit more informed, but also
he's a specialist, yeah.
He's a specialist. He's very elite. I mean, he's Sir William Bradshaw, and he was invited to the party. But even he doesn't really have any good answers. He has more sympathy towards him, and he certainly understands what a terrible person Dr. Holmes has been. But it just feels like the options are so limited, that there's so little that anyone can do, and so few people who are sympathetic to what this is like and what Septimus and Lucrezia, I suppose, are going through.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Yeah, there's this real empathetic quality that you were just describing in these passages. And, I mentioned earlier when we were introducing this episode that Virginia Woolf had a number of episodes of mental illness. And I think it's in the letters, I think it's in her sister's letters, at least there's some biographical information about Virginia Woolf's own experience about hearing the birds singing in Greek. And in that same passage that I was reading from about Septimus, something like that happens. A sparrow perched on the railing opposite chirped Septimus, Septimus 4 or 5 times over, and went on drawing its notes out to sing freshly and piercingly in Greek words how there is no crime. And, joined by another sparrow, they sang in voices prolonged and piercing in Greek words from trees in the meadow of life beyond a river where the dead walk, how there is no death. There was his hand, there the dead. White things were assembling behind the railings opposite, but he dared not look. Evans was behind the railings. And this hallucination, which becomes terrifying for him and happens again and again. I'm not saying that it's autobiographical as such, but there's elements, the interior experience, that's something she's bringing to bear here. And while there's a kind of understanding that we see, especially in Sir William Bradshaw, of what's happening to people who are suffering from mental illness in this way, it's also hopeless. Like there is no way out for these people. There's no solution. And we get a sense of the dangerousness of the medical profession here in a passage late in the book when Clarissa is thinking about Sir William Bradshaw because he's attending her party, and mentions how she consulted him once, but was kind of fearful and basically got out of there as quickly as possible.
Oh, yes.
Right? So there's a sense that you can't show that vulnerability. You can't expose that to the world because that's even worse than being alone with it. So that's what I mean by finding these parts really powerful. I mean, I had people in my family who've dealt with mental illness like that. And it's just, I don't know anything else I've ever read that kind of captures how that is. How that world is.
I was really interested on this reading in following Lucrezia as well.
Mm. Yeah, she stands outside, doesn't she, in all kinds of ways?
Yeah, Lucrezia is sort of alone. She doesn't really have connections to other people except Septimus. I mean, she's got connections to her landlord, I suppose, and Dr. Holmes, but like she feels very isolated. She has no one else she can turn to, and she depends on him being stable for all sorts of reasons, emotional and social and mental and also financial. One assumes like that's not really going into too detailed, but what is she going to do if he dies? Like he is the breadwinner. So she's not in a good place, let's say. And she doesn't get what to do, right? She's very sympathetic to what Dr. Holmes is saying, which is, just go to the theater. It'll be fine. And she's like, yeah, that seems like good advice. Why don't you just do what he says? And does not trust Sir Bradshaw, who wants to take him away from her. But there's an interesting moment when at some point Septimus has her bring out his papers.
I was just looking at that passage too.
Yeah. He's been having her transcribe things that he's been saying. And at this point, for whatever reason, he wants her to burn them all. And Lucrezia laid her hands on them. Some were very beautiful, she thought. She would tie them up, for she had no envelope, with a piece of silk. And there's this, that moment struck me as really interesting. Like she has been writing down potentially the ravings of somebody who's overwhelmed with religious ecstasy or other types of mental phenomena. And yet she's she's both sort of doing the wifely thing. I don't know. She's doing this very diligent thing of writing them down, but also she's trying to see the good in them. She's actively engaging with them and wants to appreciate them. And when she looks at all this writing, her instinct is to think of the beautiful moments and not the upsetting things.
Yeah, she's really, I think she's very sincere when she's expressing this devotion to him. She's like, even if they took him, she said, she would go with him. They could not separate them against their wills, she said. And then a little later on, she puts the papers away and she said nothing should separate them. She sat down beside him. No one could separate them, she said. And then she got up to go into the bedroom to pack their things, right? So like she may know that the doctor is trying to get Septimus away on his own, but she's doing everything she can to stick close with him. And it's partly her own vulnerability, I'm sure, but it's also this deep loyalty, which Septimus sees, but she can't ultimately protect him in the end.
Yeah.
He could see her like a little hen with her wings spread, barring the passage of the doctor when the doctor tries to get in.
Exactly. And all of this is sort of undercut by the fact that it would appear that Septimus's, so to speak, true love was a man that he served under during the war named Evans, who they became very close. And what exactly that looked like?
There's a nice passage on that.
Yes, there is. They're described as being a case of two dogs playing on a hearth rug.
Yeah, it was a case of two dogs playing on a hearth rug, one worrying a paper screw, snarling, snapping, giving a pinch now and then at the old dog's ear, the other lying somnolent, blinking at the fire, raising a paw, turning and growling good-temperedly. They had to be together, share with each other, fight with each other, quarrel with each other. But when Evans was killed just before the armistice in Italy, Septimus, far from showing any emotion or recognizing that here was the end of a friendship, congratulated himself upon feeling very little and very reasonably. The war had taught him.
Yeah.
So there's a past there, which we just get a glimpse of. We don't get much. But Evans continues to be present in his mind, right? In the hallucinations that we saw earlier, and in other ways as well, maybe.
Yeah, Evans keeps coming back to his mind, and I don't know. It's too easy to go into sort of unprofessional psycho jargon. Say like, oh, he hasn't processed this or anything. But like,
well, we definitely get a real hint when in the passage I just read. There's a parenthetical sentence that says, Lucrezia, who had only seen him once, called him "quote unquote" a quiet man, a sturdy red-haired man, undemonstrative in the company of women. That could mean a lot of things, right?
That sure could. It also makes it clear which dog is which, I guess.
Yeah.
So to speak, if one of them is the one that's being playful and so forth, and the other one is just sort of looking at the fire and growling good-temperedly every so often to like calm down, in a sense, then Septimus, who for the most part has been the quiet, introverted one that we've known throughout the book, but who we know was a very extroverted, poetry-loving, wide-eyed youth, we get the sense that that was Septimus. He has been radically changed. Yet another indication of how radically he's been changed by what he saw during the war.
No, that's exactly right.
And so if Evans comes off as the person that Septimus loved and lost, in a sense, we get a weird reflection of that in Clarissa with her relationship with Sally, the person who she had a very intense relationship with that culminated in a kiss. But surely nothing more than that could ever have happened.
Yeah, it's all very multi-layered. I mean, Clarissa and Sally's connection isn't the only one that's nostalgically recalled here. I mean, there's also Peter and Clarissa and all that kind of stuff. But the Clarissa's connection with Sally is incredibly powerful, I think, especially in the ways in which Clarissa recalls that part of her life. There's a number of passages that unpack this, but there's one that's particularly beautiful where Clarissa is remembering what it was like to have Sally in the house, where she was growing up. There's one passage where it says she can remember standing in her bedroom at the top of the house, saying aloud, "She is beneath this roof. She is beneath this roof." Right? So she can recall what it was like to feel that. She can't recall the feeling, but she can recall the circumstances, right? She could remember going cold with excitement and doing her hair in a kind of ecstasy. And now the old feeling began to come back to her as she took out her hairpins, laid them on the dressing table, began to do her hair. She recalls the feeling, if it were to die now, 'twere to be most happy. That was her feeling, Othello's feeling. And she felt it, she was convinced, as strongly as Shakespeare meant Othello to feel it, all because she was coming down to dinner in a white frock to meet Sally Seton. And the passage goes on and on and on. And the evening wears on. And finally, they're all out on that terrace, that place where a number of people remember different encounters. So a couple of the men are there, Peter and another one are there. And she and Sally fell a little behind. Then came the most exquisite moment of her whole life, passing a stone urn with flowers in it. Sally stopped, picked a flower, kissed her on the lips. The whole world might have turned upside down. The others disappeared. There she was, alone with Sally. And she felt that she had been given a present, wrapped up and told just to keep it, not to look at it. A diamond, something infinitely precious, wrapped up, which, as they walked up and down, she uncovered, or the radiance burnt through, the revelation, the religious feeling, when old Joseph and Peter faced them. So there's this kind of interruption at the end that punctures the bubble of this exquisite moment. Right. And again, like in many of these passages, it's so multi-layered, right? What's going on there in this memory of this turning point, right? She and Sally aren't going to have a future together, right? They're going to become separated and they're only going to see each other again decades and decades later. And Clarissa's going to get married to Richard Dalloway and have this kind of, very, in some ways, very ordinary life, right?
And Sally's going to get married and have an even more ordinary life in many ways.
Yeah, she's got 4 or 5 giant sons and stuff.
5 kids. She lives out in the countryside. She's got,
Yeah, right. I mean, they're both going to have these regular kind of lives, but this thing happened between them that's precious, wrapped up, and either is uncovered or the radiance itself burns through, right? And it's transcendent, right? It's described here as a revelation, a religious feeling. And it's in a moment like that, there's others too, but it's moments like that we see the kind of twinship of the Septimus story and the Clarissa story. Their lives are totally different, but this idea of the transcendent moment, which can end in different kinds of ways, is something that structures both of their experiences, and they come together on that one day and come into contact the day of the party, and especially in people talking about Septimus's death at the party. So there's this way in which the thing that structures your life, this thing that's at the center of your life, is made visible both in a tragic mode in the experience of Septimus and also in this other kind of mode, this reflective mode, I guess, in the experience of Clarissa. So I feel like this is a book that's about order, about how you find order and shape in your life more than almost anything else, whether tragically or reflectively.
Yeah, I think the weird connections between Clarissa and Septimus really drive that home because their lives are, as you say, they're very different. They're not running in parallel. It's not like a story where you've got two people who are doing the same things but differently and they don't know it. It's much more subtle how the connections and resonances form, but they're all there, or there are a lot of them, let's say. And even just now when you were reading that passage out, I realized, oh, of course, when she's about to have her biggest moment, her biggest emotional moment as a youth, she thinks of a line of Shakespeare, which is exactly what Septimus would have done. He was, we've been told again and again that he's obsessed with Shakespeare as a youth. And then that phase of his life passes by and he doesn't care as much for Shakespeare anymore. But Clarissa doesn't know about this. She gets barely any contact with Septimus. When she hears of his death, she doesn't know that it's somebody that she had a close encounter with earlier that day.
But it's uncanny, right? Because there's this incredible symmetry in their experience. When she withdraws into a quiet little room at the party right after she's heard about his death, and she reflects on him. She thinks about this young man. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate, people feeling the impossibility of reaching the center which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart, rapture faded, one was alone. There was an embrace in death. But this young man who had killed himself, had he plunged holding his treasure? If it were now to die, 'twere now to be most happy, she had said to herself once, coming down in white. So in that moment, right, neither one of them know it, but their interior experience is absolutely lined up.
And yet during that section, when Clarissa is thinking on Septimus and filling in tremendous amounts of motivation that she has no access to, and she's not, I don't think, quite right in how she's reading the situation, but she's interpreting the details of what he's done through how she would be. She's putting herself in his shoes and getting a lot of details wrong, or she just doesn't have enough information. And yet there's still some through line connecting them. And there are more through lines that could be connecting them, but they just don't know it because you can't invite everyone to your party. Well, we could probably talk about Mrs. Dalloway for another couple hours.
I was just going to say, we could talk about this book all day. I mean, it's an odd book in some ways, but it's beautiful. I think good for dipping into also. I mean, it's a book I think you could read sections of and just enjoy the texture of the language if you didn't have the patience for reading the whole thing. But the language is extraordinary.
You could, but I also found myself really, for a book that doesn't have a lot of compelling plot, let's say, and that's in the sense of one action leading to another. In a sense where when I look up reviews of the book on whatever site, a lot of people say, nothing happens in this book. And so if you like stylistic stuff or you like whatever, you might like this. I don't know. I kind of disagree. I found it very compelling how psychologically you would be getting from one place to another, right? Every person that you encounter has a desire, and that desire is meditated on and acted towards as you go along. And I found myself wanting to know every step of the way, not so much what was going to happen next, I guess, is what were they going to feel next, or what were they going to think next, or sometimes what would happen next. I don't know. I felt it was very propulsive in a way that we don't normally describe Mrs. Dalloway as being.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But anywho, other than that, what else have you been reading lately?
Well, I had a kind of an amusing reading experience about a week and a half ago, where I was going to be getting on a plane. And so I grabbed a book, I thought, which I had been meaning to read for some while. It's a book called Violence Over the Land, Indians and Empires in the Early American West by Ned Blackhawk. And it was in my daughter's room, so I went to go pick it up. But I accidentally picked up a completely different book and ended up with it on the plane. Blood Struggle, The Rise of Modern Indian Nations by Charles Wilkinson. And it's nonfiction. I like nonfiction. I read a lot of nonfiction. And this one is basically about Native American independence efforts and efforts at asserting sovereignty, basically from the late 19th century through the 20th century, but especially focusing on the period from the early 50s, when you had a whole generation of Native American men and women who had come back from World War II and who were ready to kind of organize in ways that are a little bit different than had been in the case before. And it was a really good book. I got a whole lot out of it, and I'm really looking forward to coming back to some sections of it and learning in more detail, because it's covering an awful lot of ground.
Sure. Yeah, no, that sounds great. The book that I've read recently is Dracula. I finally read that.
Awesome. How'd you like it?
It was so much fun. It was so wild. I was reading it for another podcast because in my other podcast, we were doing something that was based off of Dracula. So I thought, what better excuse to finally read the whole thing? I didn't know that when I was about 3/4 of the way through it, all the internet would start reading Dracula. Because have you heard about this? There's this new Dracula service where they because Dracula is an epistolatory novel, or, it's written in diaries and so forth. So everything is dated, and they're sending out the sections on the day that they are written down in the book.
Oh, wow. That's so cool.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, but everybody was talking about it on Twitter and such when I had already gotten most of the way through it. So it was very surreal. It is such a fun book. It is so wildly plotted. And it's so delightful. It's such a good, again, very propulsive sense of, what's going to happen next. It leaves you on tenterhooks. But also, like, the sexual politics in the book are just wild.
Oh, yeah?
Have you read it?
I read parts of it long, long, long ago. I don't remember anything about it. So I really should, especially if we ever decide to do something around like either epistolary novels or letters or whatever. It would be super fun.
Yeah. So there's a character, Lucy Westenra. She's writing back and forth with Mina Harker, who's, fabulous in this book. But she's talking about how one day she got 3 proposals from 3 different men. And she'd already made up her mind about which one she wanted to marry, but she has to say no to the first 2 who approach her. And, she feels very bad about it. And she says at one point, if only there was some way that I could just say yes to all of them. It's very silly that there isn't, but what would that be like? And then immediately after, the 2 gentlemen who are said no to they see each other, and one says to the other, well, we've both been turned down by the greatest woman who ever lived. I guess we should start hanging out a lot. And they do. They form this kind of weird friendship polycule thing that is clearly a stand-in for an actual relationship. And as Lucy gets, her blood drained away by the vampires, each of them in turn donates his blood to her.
Oh my God.
And it's just like, yeah, I've read The Flea. I've read John Donne. I know what that's a metaphor for. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's so wild. It's so interested in alternative forms of sexuality, but it has to do it in these outlandish, repressed ways of talking about it. That was really great. I don't think it's a terribly profound novel. I don't know if we do an episode about it, it would probably be fun, but it's, this is a more fun book to read than Frankenstein in many ways, but Frankenstein is the more interesting book to talk about. Yeah. So, but I definitely recommend anyone. It was much more fun than I had ever been led to believe from hearing about people reading it.
That's awesome. So what are we reading next?
Well, I hope you started, because what we're reading next is James Joyce's Ulysses.
It's going to be very exciting.
It is going to be very exciting. I have started reading it because it's a big book. I have read bits of this book before. I'm enjoying coming back to it, and I'm also enjoying reading it. I'm listening to an audiobook of it. And so
how's that?
Well, it's hard to find it's a hard book to do a good audiobook of.
Oh, that's interesting.
You have to know so much, because there's so much stuff packed into the book. And we'll probably talk about this in the next episode. So the reader is very good at doing some things right, but also clearly doesn't get some of the more recondite jokes that I happen to get, some of the Greek and Latin-based jokes. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Because I've studied a bit of Greek and Latin, and I assume this person has it. You need to spend so much effort understanding what's going on to really hit every single note correctly. It's nice to hear it in many ways, and especially some of the passages that are pretty incomprehensible. You just let them wash over you, and you enjoy the rhythms of Joyce's language, which are fantastic. Yeah. But it is occasionally frustrating. Yeah. But that's Ulysses. It's a big book.
It's going to be fun. And we're going to come at it through the lens of the city, right? So that'll be a neat way to focus it, and maybe choose some passages that bring out that dimension.
Exactly. So I'm excited for that. Listeners, I hope you're excited for that as well. But in the meantime, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/56, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
See you again at the Spouter-Inn.